You are watching With a Cup of Tea, a production of This House of Books, an independent bookstore cooperative and tea shop in downtown Billings. Now, here's our show.
Okay, I'm here today with Ken Robison, and Ken has a series of books we're going to discuss, but first of all, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I was born a historian, I think. My little one-room country school in southern Choteau County had a little library, and every history book I think I memorized. And I wrote a little book, about a 20-page book about Slim the cowboy when I was about 8 years old, and I've loved history ever since. I went on through a long career in the Navy and came back to Montana after spent a lot of time on the ocean and in exciting contingency operations and things like that. And now I get to do what I love to do, which is research and write Western history. And I do that at Fort Benton at the Overholtzer Research Center. I do it in Great Falls with the Historic Preservation Commission. And I do it in Sun River Valley at the Historical Society. So I have kind of a regional approach. Montana's my window to history.
Okay. So you have a couple of series. There's one in particular about the Civil War, and I think there are 3 books in that.
There are. The first one was this Montana Territory in the Civil War that I brought out early in the 150th anniversary. 2011, Montanans were telling me, the Civil War didn't mean anything to us. We didn't have big battles, but so we don't need to pay attention to the 150th anniversary of the biggest event in American history. And I thought, that's wrong, but rather than argue with them, I sat down and started writing, and it came out with Montana Territory and the Civil War. Actually, the subtitle's really telling. It's a frontier forged on the battlefield. And as I went through overlaying the Civil War on the formation of Montana Territory in the midst of the Civil War in 1864, and in a very hurried fashion because President Lincoln wanted loyal Union territories to come in on the side of the Union during the war. And so that and little events like the spring of 1862, in 3 magical months, when the Southern senators and representatives had been withdrawn from Congress, they passed the Homestead Act, the Pacific Railway Act, the Morrell Land Grant College Act, and prohibition of slavery in the Western Territories. All 4, of course, have been blocked by Southerners for a number of years. So if anything frames the future for Montana and really all the Western states that came in, that series of legislation did.
But it was by no means certain that that Montana would come in on the side of the Union. I mean, there were so many Confederate soldiers that came up here.
It was the exile of choice for the Confederates and for the Southern families, and that really led me to the second book, which is Confederates in Montana Territory. It's again, I love mysteries and legends, and this one had a very good legend about the Montana being formed in the shadow of Price's army, while Price being the general in charge of the Confederate forces in Missouri, and he suffered a big defeat in the war, actually a series of defeats. And as early as 1865, the Montana Post, our first newspaper, was talking about the left wing of Price's army coming to Montana Territory. But it was more than soldiers, more than Confederates that came here. A lot of their families left Missouri and Kentucky and Tennessee and even Arkansas because their plantations, the slaves had been freed, and the plantations had been ruined really because of this great Union liberation of the slaves, and so many of them headed west, and many of the ones that did head west wound up in Montana Territory. And a good example was a couple of future major ranchers in Montana, John and Perry Moore. They were teenagers during the Civil War, and they'd fought with the Confederate Kentucky Cavalry. And in the last action of President Jeff Davis of the Confederacy to escape, he was being protected by that Kentucky Cavalry that John and Perry Moore were a part of. And so finally, when they cornered Jeff Davis and he surrendered and his fighting force did, they returned back to their home and found their mother and younger siblings. Their father died before the war, but their mother and younger siblings were gone, and nobody was on their place. And they found with a neighbor a note from the mother saying, "We've gone to the western mines." Well, it took them a year or so, but they tracked him down, and where on earth would the reunion of these two Confederates with their southern family be than Diamond City, Confederate Gulch, right across the Missouri River from Helena. So there's just story after story, and John and Perry Moore became very, very prominent Montana ranchers, and I gave a talk in Helena, and a third generation forward rather, John Moore came and gave me a copy of their family history because he enjoyed the story of their ancestors so much. So it's been fun taking these around the state. And of course the third one and the final one, although I keep getting asked to do more, and I did leave a couple of guys out that I really would like to include. So anyway, Yankees and Rebels on the Upper Missouri with a subtitle of Steamboats, Gold, and Peace. And I thought that was a good way to wrap things up for Montana's participation, or Montanans that participated in the Civil War. It's a tribute to steamboating, both how the steamboats were used during the Civil War on the Missouri River, and then the massive increase in steamboating, first on the Upper Missouri that goes on up to Fort Benton, but the Upper Missouri really includes the Yellowstone because that's one drainage, and a lot of, in the 1870s, first in support of the Army and then in support of city building, first Colson and then Billings and so on. Steamboats became really important on the Yellowstone, and they're both in here, along with some really colorful characters like Yellowstone Kelly. And the whole idea behind the support for General Crook and Custer in 1876 when they had the Sioux War going on, and Grant Marsh, the great steamboat captain, brought the steamboat far west up the Yellowstone and then on up the Bighorn and supported the troops, moved troops back and forth across the river, and then after the Custer defeat took 50 or more of the wounded from the battle down to Fort Abraham Lincoln in the Dakotas, the home base for the 7th Cavalry. So great stories, and a lot of fun engaging people in talking, because so many they either know about the stories or they have myths and stories that they want to sound out whether they're true or not, and then a lot of people come with memorabilia and from their family, either diaries that were kept or photos or different things. So unlike the original word that I had that didn't mean anything to Montanans, it actually meant everything to men, women, and children that came to Montana Territory and to the formation of the territory.
So a 3-book series dealing primarily with how the Civil War has impacted Montana.
And Montanans.
And Montanans, exactly. And we do live with the legacy still. It's, the names on the landscape still.
Yeah, they didn't quite get away with naming Virginia City Verena after Jeff Davis's wife, but
no.
The compromise was Virginia City, so.
Yeah, there you go. Pretty good. Yeah. And then you have another series as well that's, I think we only have one book from this series, but it's about World War I in Montana.
And I got started on this for almost the same reason, and it wasn't that people were telling me that World War I didn't mean anything to Montana, but they were telling me that it was so short and so brutal, and nobody was particularly interested in Montana unless they had descendants involved, and the fact that nobody was doing anything in Montana about it. So I brought out the very first book on Montanans in World War I. The title is World War I Montana, The Treasure State Prepares. And the reason I did that, I originally wrote what would be 2 books worth, but my publisher, the History Press in Charleston, South Carolina, only goes about 270 pages or so. They don't come out with 600-page books. And I'm glad they didn't, because it allowed me to bring the first one out about if any country ever went into a war less prepared, I don't know which country it is. Our total between the state National Guards and the National Army for the U.S. at the beginning of the war in April 1917 was about 300,000. And there'd be that many casualties in a single major battle in France. So we were so unprepared, and it took us a year to build up the Army to where we could have deployed in France enough fighting force. By April 1918, we had about 500,000, and then a couple 100,000 coming over every month after that. So we were finally getting the forces to get engaged, and really between between April and November, excuse me, we had enough troops added to the British and French forces, which were still slogging along after 3 more years that they'd been fighting, and that brought us to a success against the Germans. The Germans had been able to shift a couple million troops from the Eastern Front when the Bolsheviks took over Russia and took them out of the war, but the U.S. more than made up for that. And if we had not been in the war, that movement of the German troops over would have been decisive, and the British-French would have lost. So it's a tremendously important story. Montana's role extends all the way from the mines in Butte that put out copper so that we could really say every bullet fired by the Americans in World War I was encased in Butte copper.
Yep.
And every mile of communication, not only in France but really at home too, because this was electrification age and so on, was out of the smelters in Great Falls, that copper wire. So between Butte copper and the refined products coming out of Great Falls, it was hugely important. And the story of what was going on in the communities when every little town, Haywarden or whatever little town, had a Red Cross auxiliary working huge hours to produce sweaters and things like that. And I've read so many letters and testimony by the troops that the single most valuable thing they felt they had, other than their weapons, was their sweater. And it was a Red Cross sweater that had come from a little Red Cross auxiliary in Montana or around the West. So Montana women found for the first time a much broader participation in both the war and in the economy, because right after the war started and the men started going into the training camp at Camp Lewis near Tacoma to get trained to go overseas. Places like the Great Northern Railroad Roundhouse in Great Falls was hiring women to replace them. And that was true in quite a few of the industries spread around the towns in Montana and certainly other states. And it had happened earlier in England, and we sort of patterned all of our women's new roles after what had been done in England in the years they'd already been fighting. But the Navy took women in as what they called yeomanettes.
Yeomans, yeah.
And they were the administrative yeoman rate. They did so much better in both dictation and typing than most of the men that the Navy welcomed them. And it really was the beginning of the waves that came in large numbers then in World War II. And I mean, Butte entertainers, there were 2 entertainers from Butte that were hired by the Eddie Cantor-led over their theater. There was no USO, no United Services Organization to go entertain the troops. So guys like Eddie Cantor, the big entertainer, helped organize groups that would go over, and 2 Butte women went and were very popular among the troops in entertaining, and Red Cross nurses, even the Marines began to take women in their administrative side to free up men to do the fighting.
Wow.
So hugely important. First book was Montana World War One. Montana, the Treasure State prepares, and in September, the second and final of that World War One series will come out, and that'll be Montanans in the Great War, over open warfare over there, because that's the combat period from April to November. And lots of exciting stories in this one, and a bunch coming in the one in September.
You tend to tell these things as stories too.
They are, and that's my whole approach to history, is the way to engage people, and that includes a lot of people who probably wouldn't admit to being all that great history fans, but they love good stories, and they love stories that involve Montana men, women, and kids, and so I find the stories and present them, and people like it, and I have fun.
Well, thanks so much.
Great,
Appreciate
thanks,
you
Mark.
having me in.
Very good.
Hey.
There it is.
This has been a production of This House of Books. If you'd like to be a part of the cooperative, please visit thishouseofbooks.com/get involved.